Hey, History Geeks. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, I have two powerful stories for you today. This is a story about loyalty, sacrifice, and what happens when war doesn't just divide a nation, but divides a family. Because during the Revolution, men weren't just choosing sides against an empire, they were choosing sides against each other. In one case, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Lewis Morris, was warned not to sign the document, not by the British, but by his own brother. And what makes this story even more fascinating is that his brother, Staats Long Morris, was a major general in the British Army. In another instance, a continental general named Philip Schuyler would find himself fighting a war against his own cousin, British officer Arndt Schuyler the Peister. So today we're going to look at two families, two wars within the same war, and two stories that reveal just how personal the American Revolutionary War became. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the human side of the American Revolution, where loyalty to family and loyalty to cause did not always walk hand in hand. These weren't simply political disagreements between strangers. These were brothers, cousins, and lifelong friends. People who had grown up together suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of a revolution. And in many cases, the cost of choosing a side could be devastating. Think about that for a moment. Imagine someone you love, someone you trust, warning you that if you take a stand, you could lose everything. Your home, your livelihood, possibly even your life. Because before the war, before sides were chosen, Lewis and Stat Morris were simply brothers, raised in the same world, walking the same land, shaped by the same family, the same traditions, and the same empire. There was no divide here, no lines drawn in the sand, just two men who had no idea that one day they would stand on opposite sides of history. And when that moment finally came, it was Lewis Morris who had to make a choice, not as a politician, not as a distant figure in history, but as a brother. And this just wasn't some desperate rebel with nothing to lose. He had everything. A massive estate in New York called Morrisana, with nearly 2,000 acres along the Harlem River, land that had been in his family for generations. Because everything Lewis stood to lose had already been built long before him. The Morris family was not a family born in rebellion. Its roots stretched deep into the British colonial world, tied to wealth, land, and royal authority. And that story began with Lewis Morris's great-grandfather, Richard Morris. Richard Morris fought in the ranks of Oliver Cromwell's army during the English Civil War in the mid-1600s, a brutal conflict that shook England and helped bring down a king. After the Civil War, he crossed the Atlantic through Barbados and eventually arrived in New York, where opportunity awaited in the growing English colonies. There, Richard purchased a large tract of land in what is now the Bronx. That land became the foundation of the Morrisana estate, one of the great colonial manors of early America. But it was Richard's son, Lewis Morris, who transformed the family into one of the most powerful dynasties in colonial America. He expanded the estate and eventually rose to become a royal governor of New Jersey. As governor, he became respected for defending the rights of colonial landowners and challenging political opponents who threatened local authority. A man of English roots and strong ties to the British crown, he expanded the estate and eventually rose to become a royal governor of New Jersey. As governor, he became respected for defending the rights of colonial landowners and challenging political opponents who threatened local authority. His influence became so great that Morristown, New Jersey was eventually named in his honor. And from this powerful legacy would emerge his grandson, another Lewis Morris. A man born into privilege, raised in a family tied directly to royal government and British authority, who would one day risk everything by signing the Declaration of Independence. And from this powerful legacy would emerge two brothers, both raised in privilege, both heirs to a family shaped by British power, wealth, and royal authority. But as the colonies drifted toward revolution, the Morris family itself began to divide. Lewis Morris would ultimately choose the path of independence. But his brother, Staats Long Morris, chose another path entirely. Staats Long Morris had risen through the ranks of the British Army, eventually becoming a major general sworn to serve the very crown his family had supported for generations. Think about that for a moment. One brother preparing to break away from the British Empire, the other sworn to defend it. Same family, same legacy, completely different choices. As tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to rise, the divide within the Morris family grew deeper. One brother moving toward revolution and the other toward loyalty to the crown. And then the warning came, not from the crown, not from Parliament, but from his own brother. Staats Long Morris warned Lewis Morris that if he signed the Declaration of Independence, he would lose everything, his land, his wealth, his home, and believe it or not, it wasn't an empty threat. Because this wasn't just rebellion, this was treason. And if the British won, men like Lewis Morris wouldn't just lose their position, they would lose everything. Then came July 1776 in Philadelphia. The room was heavy, not with fear, but with understanding. One by one, the men stepped forward, each knowing exactly what was at stake. And then his turn came. Lewis Morris did not hesitate. He stepped forward, looked at the pen, and made his choice. It is recorded that he said, "Damn the consequences, give me the pen." And his brother was right. After the British captured New York in 1776, the consequences came quickly. Morrisana sat directly in the path of war. British and Hessian troops swept through the region, and the Morris estate was repeatedly occupied, stripped, and devastated. Fields were destroyed, livestock taken, timber cut down, fences burned for firewood. Even the family home was damaged and plundered. As the war consumed New York, the Morris family itself was forced to flee, scattered and displaced. Driven from the estate their family had built over generations. This was not theory, this was not politics, this was the cost of a signature. And here's the part that really gets me. It just wasn't one family. Not far from the Morris family estates, another powerful New York dynasty had risen to prominence, the Schulers. Long before the Revolution, the Schulers had become one of the most influential families in colonial New York. But unlike many of the English families that dominated the colonies, the Schulers trace their roots back to the Dutch Empire. The family's American story began in the 1600s when Philip Patrice Schuler arrived in New Netherland from Amsterdam. A fur trader and businessman, he helped build the family's fortune along the Hudson River during the era when New York was still under Dutch control. Over generations, the Schulers expanded their land, wealth, and political influence, becoming part of the elite society that governed colonial New York. And although the family never forgot its Dutch roots, generations of wealth, marriage, and political influence gradually tied the Schulers into the broader British colonial world. They married into some of the most powerful families in New York society, including the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, and eventually a rising young officer named Alexander Hamilton. Years later, Hamilton would marry Philip Schuyler's daughter, Elizabeth Schuyler, forever linking his future to one of the most powerful families in New York. By the time Philip Schuyler was born in 1733, the Schuyler name carried enormous influence. Educated, wealthy, and politically connected, Philip Schuyler became one of the leading figures in colonial New York society. But like Lewis Morris, his world would soon be shattered by revolution. And within his own extended family, the war would create painful divisions that reached all the way into the British Army itself. Among the British forces, General Philip Schuyler opposed was someone he knew well, his cousin, Arndt Schuyler de Peyster. Before the war, they weren't enemies. In 1774, while traveling northward, Arndt Schuyler de Peyster visited Philip Schuyler's estate near Saratoga. Later wrote about the journey in his personal writings and poetry, referring to his cousin simply as Phil. But revolution has a way of turning familiar faces into opposing commanders. The Schuyler family connections stretched far beyond just two cousins divided by war. And within the same powerful family network, another familiar name would soon appear. Alexander Hamilton would later marry Schuyler's daughter, Elizabeth, tying his future to one of the most influential families in New York. But war changes everything. As Philip Schuyler commanded American forces, His cousin Art Schuler de Peyster directed British operations against them. And war has a way of consuming everything around it. The same family network that once connected estates, marriages, and generations of wealth was now being pulled directly into the violence of revolution. And before long, the war itself reached the Schuler estate. In 1777, a British general, John Burgoyne, pushed south from Canada during the Saratoga campaign. The fighting swept directly across Schuler's lands. The beautiful estate de Peyster once visited as family soon found itself in the path of war. British Allied forces destroyed mills, barns, crops, and buildings connected to the Schuler property as the campaign moved through the region. And as smoke rose over the estate, another powerful New York family watched generations of wealth and history begin to disappear. For families like the Morrises and Schulers, the revolution was never just politics. Their homes, their land, and their entire world stood directly in the path of war. And even when the fighting finally came to an end, the divisions the revolution created did not simply disappear. And in the end, Lewis Morris returned to rebuild what had been lost. His brother Staats Long Morris remained loyal to the crown and was eventually buried with honor at Westminster Abbey. But the legacy of these families did not end with the revolution. Generations later, another descendant of this remarkable family would rise to prominence in yet another war. During World War II, General Cornelius von Rensselaer Schuler became a senior American general serving in the United States Army. And remarkably, he was a close relative of Art Schuler de Peyster, the British officer who once stood on the opposite side of the revolution from his American cousins. General Schuler descended from the powerful Schuler and Van Cortlandt families of New York, a reminder that the legacy of these divided Revolutionary War families continued long after the guns of 1776 fell silent. History has a way of echoing through generations. As we approach the 4th of July and the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, stories like these remind us that America's founding was shaped not only on the battlefield, but also around family tables, in divided homes, and through the difficult choices ordinary people were forced to make. As we celebrate Independence Day, it's worth remembering the families who experienced the birth of our nation firsthand, and whose sacrifices, divisions, and resilience became part of the American story. Thank you for joining us, History Geeks. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share this video with a fellow history enthusiast. And we'll see you next time as we continue uncovering the stories hidden within history.